Good morning, everyone. My name is James Donnelly. I'm the CEO of the Council Group, and joining me today is Donna Berger, a shareholder at Becker. And it struck me in seeing our registrants, Donna, from the last couple of episodes that a lot of them aren't your or my clients. So I thought I'd get more formal with our introductions, but many of you we're familiar with, so welcome back and thank you for joining us each Wednesday at noon for our discussion about how to manage through COVID-19 in our communities. Just a reminder that you can chat in your questions, as Marina said, and I'm actually literally, because I'm moderating, reading them. And a lot of people have said, why aren't you answering my questions? And we do get hundreds. So if it's really specific to one property, I try and just kind of group that in a more general question when I ask it of Donna. But we do welcome the chat, so keep them coming. Last week, we talked about putting together a plan for reopening. We were so happy to be on the right side of this curve we've been talking about for weeks and months, it seems. And we've had a lot of experience with our communities and Donna's communities in the last week, and we've had a lot more questions from you. So I'm going to entitle today's episode really implementing that plan and some of the observations and questions that have happened in the last week. So that's the topic. This is episode 7. If anything we talked about, if you have questions after the webinar or you want access to anything that we've referenced, you can always email info@castlegroup.com or visit our website at castlegroup.com, and there's actually a COVID-19 page which also has our past webinars on there for past topics. And I always like to remind everybody, in fact, we were on a Zoom today and Zoom went down. So if you ever have any technical difficulties, just log on, log back on, log off and then back on. And also I want to remind everybody, Donna's been so generous with her time, but she's not giving you specific legal advice. So there's never been a time more important for you to seek your own. But maybe what this webinar can do for you is help you form the questions you want to ask your attorney. So with that, Donna, we're getting through this, and it looks like
7 weeks. 7 weeks we've been talking about this.
I know. It's funny. I was saying to Donna before we came on, somehow her hair is perfect every time. They're about to take me off the air if I don't get a haircut.
That's because I can put it back.
Yeah. So we have, I think the governor is actually just done or just doing his latest update at the Hard Rock in Broward County. And so I haven't actually heard the outcome of that, but I do know we passed 38,000 cases this week. And Don, I did have the pleasure of being on a call this morning with Shane Strum, who's the governor's chief of staff. And before I get into the questions with you, I thought it would be interesting some of the things that came out of that for our audience. Obviously, he's announced that Florida's going to come back with 3 phases. Phase 1 has been launched to everyone except us in South Florida. And basically that phasing was, and we'll get into some questions about it, but very broadly, kind of things can start opening up. Restaurants at 25%, retail at 25%. Shane told us this morning that phase 2 will basically be similar, but 50%. And that phase 3 will be what we're calling new normal. So it'll be kind of what it's going to look like for quite some time. The other thing he told me, though, and I think this is important because we had a lot of questions about collections and late letters, Donna. He said that there's now been $30 billion of SBA funds pumped into Florida businesses. That hasn't all arrived, but all been approved. And plus with the CARES Act unemployment, it's been an incredible, unprecedented amount of money that's been pumped into the Florida economy. And I say that not because I don't appreciate that people are hurting, some are, but normally if you were in a situation like this, we would have people who couldn't pay their maintenance, and now there's just so much available funds that we have noticed that virtually no drop off in payments of maintenance fees, which is
and we have too, James, at our firm we have not seen a significant uptick in delinquency, in delinquent accounts being sent over. So I think the advice we gave several weeks ago to stay the course and see how this really falls out was correct. because, knock wood, we haven't seen anything yet.
Yeah, one question I was going to ask you later because we're talking about it. We had less than 10% of our communities say they didn't want to send reminder letters in April, and that was not really our advice, as you and I have discussed. But now we're into May, and what's your comment? I mean, at some point you do have to communicate to these owners that aren't paying that there's a process. So if you had communities in our audience that did not send a reminder letter in April, what's your recommendation in May?
It's the same recommendation we always have, James, which is small balances, small problems, big balances, big problems. You don't want to let this get out of hand. If you want to strike the right balance. Obviously, there's been a tremendous financial impact from COVID-19. But this goes again on an individualized community by community basis. You need to be talking to your people. If you didn't send out a reminder letter in April, it would not be my recommendation to follow that example into May. At this point, you need to be reaching out to your people. You need to be saying, look, associations still have to fund these essential services. Not paying is not really an option. Boards will work with delinquent owners, but it starts with communication. So certainly you need to get on track with your collection process. And then if you find out that somebody really has an issue in terms of having been furloughed or lost a job, we can talk about it then, but just delaying it creates the potential for a bigger problem because that balance continues to grow.
The other thing you and I talked briefly about before the call, and Shane didn't address it specifically this morning, but the state of emergency order, I believe, expires this week, and there hasn't been an announcement, but it is our expectation that that likely gets extended. What are your thoughts, Donna?
Yeah, the order is, it expires on the 8th, so 2 days from now, and we have every belief that it will be extended. Now, there will likely be additional openings throughout the rest of the state, but you and I are sitting in Broward County. At least in our Tri-County area, there will certainly still be a delayed reopening in these hot spots. But we have every belief that the state of emergency at the state level will be extended.
And that's important, obviously, for our boards because that gives them some powers to act more quickly. And one of the things we're going to talk new about today, and I think is really, really important for our board members, is this may be a great opportunity to see the deficiency in our documents and our rules and regulations. And we're going to probably spend some time later just to say, what could our boards do now? In the absence of an emergency order from the governor, could we put some power in our documents to be able to act more quickly? So I won't get you to answer that one yet. Two quick announcements. I thought we do a property manager call every Wednesday morning in advance of this. Just happens to fall on the same day, and it's Teacher Appreciation Week, and we have so many people at home, so many with their children, that I'm sure there's a lot of people in our audience that may not be aware it's Teacher Appreciation Week, but if anyone needs some appreciation, trying to teach all these kids remotely must be amazing. And the second thing is May 18th is Mental Health Awareness Day, which we celebrate at Castle. And you probably all read in the press the impact this pandemic is having on all of our mental health. So two, I think, days, sometimes I wonder why we have all these days to recognize things, but I really think it brings into focus, in this case, teachers and mental health. So Donna, I want to kind of connect last week with this week. We suggested that it's hard for us to say, here's your plan, because every community is different, but we laid out a framework on how that should happen, starting with it being progressive, step by step. Secondly, kind of start with the regulatory environment. And then thirdly, we have to make sure all CDC guidelines are followed. And I expressed to my managers and our audience today, the CDC guidelines are so fundamental. It's really what's stopping this spread. I'm just going to stop there for a moment. So step-by-step regulatory framework, CDC as kind of a foundational impact. I'm not sure we should always probably be following that, but comments on those kind of first three steps of the framework, Donna.
Well, Listen, first I want to tell our audience that James and I do read your questions as they come in. And I know that you want us to get off pools. We're probably going to spend a little bit of time on pools today because people are still struggling with the do we open it? We've gotten back feedback. I've gotten back feedback, James, that some pools have already been closed again because they couldn't enforce the social distancing. So when you laid out that framework, where do we look to see what we need to do, what steps we need to take, and what framework are we operating within as we reopen these amenities? Typically, somebody living in a community association and a board that's operating one of these communities operates within a framework, and that framework is comprised of the statute, the applicable shared ownership statute, whether it's 718 for condos, 719 for cooperatives, or 720 for homeowners associations. So that's one framework within which these associations are operating. And the other framework is the terms and provisions of their own governing documents. And we're going to talk about that later in the program. Now, in addition to just those two things, so when I'm sitting on a board, I'm normally looking to the statute or I'm looking to my documents to find out what I can as a board member do. What are my obligations? What are my rights and responsibilities? Those are the two places. But because of this pandemic, we now have to look outside those two frameworks of the documents and the statute to look at the municipal orders, the applicable county orders, of course, the state orders. We're also taking our cues from government agencies. You mentioned the CDC. Some people are looking at the WHO, the World Health Organization. We're looking at a national level. We're taking cues from other states. We're looking at the success stories and the failures out there. So the whole universe of the framework within which boards operate has just expanded incredibly as a result of this crisis.
I'm going to just do some quick hits here. I want to come back to emergency orders, but we do have some listeners from outside of Florida. And one of the things that we're going to do, because each state obviously is different, and we operate in a couple others, mostly in Florida, is we'll put some links in on our website for those orders. Someone has just texted me that it's Nurses Appreciation Day. I didn't know that, but if it is, I can't think of anyone who should be appreciated more than them. In terms of and then some people from various parts of Florida saying, has phase one been implemented by the governor? And I think the answer to that is yes, except for South Florida. Is that correct, Donna?
That's correct.
And then emergency powers, we're going to talk about them in terms of our documents, but right now, what do the emergency powers that are announced by the governor, what does that allow a board to do?
So the emergency powers, which were originally enacted by the Florida legislature, James, in response to hurricanes down here in Florida, and we found boards that had problems, specifically with regard to buildings that may have been damaged in a storm and people wanting to get back into the property quickly after the storm when the building was not safe. So the Florida legislature enacted those emergency powers to give boards some tools to deal with that. So among those powers was the ability of the board, upon relying upon the advice of medical and other emergency professionals, to declare portions of the property off limits to tenants, residents, guests, and other invitees. And that's the really significant part of the emergency powers that most of our boards have relied upon throughout this pandemic, to say we're going to close off the property to contractors, we're going to close it off to realtors, we're going to reduce guest visitation. So that's the portion of the emergency powers that many boards are relying on. Other powers include the ability to appoint assistant officers. So I have a few communities where we've had board members become ill and they needed to appoint other people to step in. The emergency powers allows them to do that. The emergency powers allows the board to call meetings with as much notice as is practicable, okay? So if you need to get together on something, you can do it with fewer than 48 hours notice. But I would caution this. I've had a couple boards ask about passing special assessments for some upcoming projects. I personally do not believe that the emergency powers is going to be used across the board. If you've got a project and you have to pass a special assessment, speak to counsel. Don't just assume that that means across the board, every type of meeting can now be held with fewer notice than is typically required.
You know, last week our recommendation was to use this framework to draft a plan, which we've done for our communities and most have, and to get that approved by the board and their legal counsel. And it brought up some questions about meetings. And we at Castle have been getting a lot of questions. Should we be meeting? Can we be meeting? And our advice to them is meeting has never been easier, thanks to technology. So our recommendation is 100% meet and do all the appropriate noticing you can, even if you do have emergency powers. If you need them, use them. But if you don't, your comments, Donna, on to our listeners on should they be having meetings or shouldn't they? And I'm even taking it a step further. You know, there's some planning we need to do for post-recovery. You know, you may have a committee set up for that and they should meet. So your comments on to our listeners on holding meetings.
I couldn't agree more, James. This is the time for you to be meeting. I even recommend weekly. You know, there's a reason that we are all glued to the TV whenever the National Coronavirus Task Force comes on. We're in home. Most people are in their homes. They're working from home. You mentioned teaching their children at home. You've got people who are either ill or caring for somebody who is. We're homebound for the most part, particularly down here in South Florida and in other parts, in other states in the country where there's hot spots. There's really nowhere to go. It's the same in your community. They want to hear from you. This is a chance for your board to really shine, and they're looking for information. And here's the thing. If you're not providing them with that information, somebody else will. So to your point, James, you're absolutely right. I've got people saying, if we only knew it was this easy with a Zoom conference, most of our clients are embracing these virtual meetings, and we're going to be looking long-term, next legislative session, to make sure that this becomes an option for communities to use virtual meetings as an option.
I'm being reminded by some of our listeners, you and I refer to South Florida thinking Southeast Florida, but our friends in Collier and Lee are mad at me now. So just to be clear, it's only the Tri-County area that's been excluded from the governor's phase one. Does not.
Well, and to our friends in Southwest Florida, I'm a Chicagoan. I don't know how my parents wound up on this coast and not yours, but I'm a fan.
That's good. So we have our plan. We've got it approved in our meeting that we recommend. It's approved by legal counsel. Now, really, the plan is about reopening some of the amenities. And we also got chastised a little bit from our listeners. We talked too much about pools and not about tennis courts last week, Donna. So I'm going to jump in here so I don't forget that we need to talk about that. That was actually included specifically in the order that tennis facilities can reopen for singles. Any further guidance on opening tennis courts or pickleball?
So in some counties, tennis courts were never closed, okay? In some counties, they were never closed, but your board may have decided to close them for safety reasons. So you're still, even if your county or your municipality didn't address your private park or your private tennis court or your outdoor shuffleboard court, your board, in an abundance of caution and as part of your COVID-19 protocols, may have chosen to close those facilities. For those sitting in counties where the county did make you close those facilities and they're now reopening, those orders that I've seen, particularly Miami-Dade, do allow courts to be open, but for singles play. And I live in a household where I've got tennis players here. We've got the tennis channel on constantly. The USTA, which is the United States Tennis Association, has released some specific guidelines about safe play in the midst of this pandemic. It's singles only, and from what I understand, each player brings their own can of tennis balls, okay? And you hit it, and the other person only kicks the ball back or uses their racket. So there's ways to do this. Now, if you're listening and you've got an outdoor basketball court, let's say, somebody asked me this question the other day. One-on-one basketball is a contact sport. that would be very difficult to enforce. You can't enforce social distancing, but those basketball courts are being opened up with regard to playing a game called horse. I don't know, I wasn't a basketball player. James, you look tall enough that you might have been a basketball player. Some game called horse, there's ways to do this. So there's a lot of resources online if you've got certain outdoor facilities to figure out how you can reopen those safely and comply with social distancing.
Well, that brings me back to this CDC guidelines. If you can't do the activity in compliance with the CDC guidelines, you can't do the activity. It's as simple as that. And the game of horse, of course, is one where it's one guy gets or gal gets to take a shot and the other one has to match it. And so you're able to have social distancing versus a whole basketball game. And then I see some comments in here, you know, in my jurisdiction, a tennis court or something isn't allowed to be open, and that's highly possible. So again, you know, I think it's good that the governor is issuing statewide guidelines, and same in other states. But we said from the beginning, Donna, you have to watch your local guidelines, and those are the ones you have to follow.
Well, to that point, James, remember we talked about this. Whatever applicable orders, whether it's the municipality or the county, you've got to always know before you make a decision where you're at in that timeline. Is that order still in effect? Does it impact you? That's the floor. You don't want to go underneath the floor. So if your county says tennis courts cannot be opened, you are at great risk if you're opening amenities that are still closed under any applicable order that impacts your community.
I'm getting lots of questions here about tennis courts. So one of the comments is, can you play doubles? And I mean, the answer to that is no. And the comment is, well, that may cause more injuries. We're used to playing doubles, so we don't have to run all the way from left to right.
Yeah. Well, let's touch on that. If you're in a county that never closed your tennis court, okay, then there's not going to be a reopen order that discusses singles play versus doubles play. Then it's really a discussion between you, your management company, and your council to figure out ways, if there is any way to comply with CDC guidelines while you're playing doubles. I will tell you, for the most part, the counties have already evaluated that, and if they've said no doubles play, it's because they don't think it's feasible to enforce social distancing with doubles. So you really do have to take your cues. But again, in some counties, they weren't closed. They're not subject to those orders. But I would still urge you to take your cues from other counties where they have evaluated what can safely be done on tennis courts.
You know, I just want to remind everyone again of the business judgment rule that boards are being evaluated on or could be evaluated on. And Donna, you often will use the example, are you comfortable standing for a judge defending X or Y? And I'm reminded of it by your reference to other jurisdictions. So sometimes the guidance isn't obvious, and you do need to look to, you know, the USTA for tennis, or to a neighboring county that may have some guidance on it. So I think, though, the defense there is, do you have a plan? Do you have a reference you use to come up with that plan? And did you get legal advice?
Do you have a reference point? I don't like the comparisons from one building to the next. I sometimes feel like I'm talking to my kids because it's, well, the neighboring building's doing it, why can't we? And my answer is typically because you're smarter and you have better advice at your disposal. So you can't stand in front of a trier of fact, and when you're asked why you made these decisions, it can't be because our neighboring building did it. You know, some people are luckier than others.
The next kind of set that's coming through here about fitness centers or gyms. And my understanding from the governor's order is he is not opening up public gyms, but that doesn't apply to our private facilities. And so there are many areas of Florida and beyond Florida that you can open a gym. But I do know there's some, I believe, Miami and Broward, where you aren't allowed. So that's the end of the story. But we do have a lot of listeners who do have facilities that they're allowed to open and want to start. I've got a couple of ideas on how you could do that. Do you want to kind of give us some guidance on what we should be concerned about?
Well, incredibly, the governor's order never closed private gyms. Okay, the order said gyms, but then it made an exemption for gyms in hotels and in private residences. So the gyms really is a decision. It was a decision made by boards. Remember, we talked about the emergency powers where they can declare portions of the property off limits if they need to do so to safeguard the residents. And a lot of counties, to your point, James, did close private gyms, Miami-Dade in particular, because they were hot spots. When you're looking at gyms, again, it's what can we manage now? And I'm really urging boards to not flip the switch and say, okay, gym's open 7 days a week, 10 hours a day. That's going to be very, very hard to manage. You may want to take baby steps. If you've closed your gym, you may want to open it up a few days a week for a few hours a day when you know you can have a staff member there to make sure that people are wiping down the machines. Maybe you have your staff member wipe down the machines. You may want to remove some of the machines. I know some communities are taking out the hand weight stations, okay, because it's just a lot. Maybe you just leave the cardio. Maybe you take out the weights. Maybe you just leave 2 or 3 spaced out treadmills or ellipticals so people can get some cardio. Again, this is, you mentioned it at the outset, James, this is incremental. You want to roll it back the way you implemented it and take steps, take it week by week, see if people are managing. I did have one person say that they're requiring people to wear masks in the gym. I don't know if that's a good idea to have somebody wearing a mask while running on a treadmill. I think that's problematic, but reach out to medical experts and see if that's advisable. We're not medical experts. We can't give you that advice, but that troubled me when I heard about that.
A couple of ideas that our managers have come up with is 1, distance the equipment, 2, close every second machine, and 3, have a registration. You have to book your time in the gym so you can limit the number. So there's some kind of management tips for our audience on how to do that.
But James, before we get off gyms, because I saw a lot of questions about gyms, it also depends on the size of your room. Is it a 20 by 25 room, or are we talking on, a 10 by 10? How many residents do you have? Do you have an active confirmed infection in your building? If I have a building that has confirmed infections right now, and I still have a state of emergency in effect until May 8th, and I probably am going to have a state of emergency in effect until May 31st, my answer may be, it's going to hurt, but you need to keep it closed a little bit longer. If most of the communities that have abundant recreational amenities are our retirement communities here in Florida. Communities with a vulnerable population. It may not make sense to open up a small fitness room. You may want to start with the larger room in a clubhouse and open that where you can more easily enforce social distancing. So there are options here where you can give people some ability to use the amenities, but you're doing it in a way that makes sense for your particular community.
A lot of these conversations are kind of segueing into the next. We've had a couple of communities, 55 plus. And when I think of our 55 plus communities, we've managed, a 55 plus community that was brand new, and we've managed it for 20 years. Well, guess what? All of the residents are now 75. They're not 55 anymore. And so we've got a couple of our communities this week, Donna, that have said, look, I know our county's allowing it, but we don't think it's right for our community. And they're looking for us for some support for having a reopening plan that's more stringent than the regulations. And what we've done is there's an unending amount of data, and we can provide everyone on this call the links to it. I mean, if you're in an area that still has a high infection rate, still has a high fatality rate, it's not hard to put together a story, especially for an older community, where they shouldn't be opening it. Help us out a bit. What should we be doing as a board if we do want to have a policy that maybe is more restrictive than the law, the regulation?
Yeah, I think people have better instincts than they give themselves credit for, James. If, as a board member, you have this feeling you're uncomfortable about opening that amenity, you're worried, you have a vulnerable population, you know that you've had an infection or there's the risk, you're a large community, you know that people aren't going to social distance, or frankly, you understand your own limitations in terms of being able to clean up the amenity and to enforce social distancing, follow your instincts. I think people do have good instincts on this, but I think they get pressured. You know, this is where these county orders came into. There was tremendous pressure on board members and on our public policymakers to start opening stuff up. Unfortunately, the counties kind of pushed that back out onto boards and said, well, okay, you can open it up, but you got to meet these guidelines. It would have been helpful if those orders, in my opinion, had taken into account the constraints under which boards operate. But for those boards out there who are imposing more stringent conditions because they understand their inherent limitations in terms of being able to sanitize and enforce social distancing, and because they're cognizant of the fact that they've got people at risk, I say congratulations, bravo. That's the type of board I want leading my community, looking out for us. You're going to be criticized either way. You're going to be criticized for reopening too late, and you're going to be criticized in some quarters for opening too soon. Most boards, James, know that criticism it's just an unfortunate part of the job. But the boards I've been talking to who have been reaching out to their insurance agents and asking, what should we do? You'd be surprised how well, maybe you wouldn't. The insurance agents are being very conservative and urging boards to keep this stuff closed until they're absolutely confident that they can open it in a way that complies with the orders, with CDC guidelines, but also with a standard duty of care.
Well, I think that's great guidance for our listeners, because I know a lot of them are feeling the pressure of not following the guidelines specifically. And my more general thought in terms of the framework that we put together was, it's really not just, we referenced an older community, but it's all demographics. You may have a high concentration of children in a community, and that would be a different set of decisions. But there are some questions coming through on other amenities that I don't think we addressed completely last week, Donna. And one is food and beverage. I know over 30 of our communities have some sort of cafe, restaurant, food and beverage. And we have issued some guidelines for that. And they basically follow the guidelines that the governor put out, with 25% capacity outdoor dining, seats 6 feet, we recommend 10 feet apart. Any guidance for our listeners if they really want to get their food and beverage operations back open?
Yeah, I think to the extent that your board can open amenities and resume services that have meaning for your members, you should. Again, you should do so. So with food and beverage, if you've reduced capacity to 25%, if you're doing takeout, but now you want to have people come eat in and you can space out the tables, you've got an advanced registration system. You may have the people serving in facial coverings. You're basically taking your cues to how local businesses are resuming these operations. That makes sense as long as you're on top of it. But one thing I think, and this may be later on your list, but I think we have to jump in with the use of waivers and releases at some point, because some communities are thinking that perhaps a silver bullet will just get people to sign a waiver and release and we'll be fine. And I'm here to tell you, unfortunately, it's not that simple.
Well, we do have a couple questions right now about that, so your timing is perfect. Basically, the question is signage, notice, waivers. If you could kind of package those together. You and I have talked in detail about this. It's not that they can't do it. I just think you want to manage expectations on the effectiveness of it. So go ahead, Donna.
So signage and waivers are going to make you feel better as a board. They're not necessarily going to protect you. It's kind of like taking a vitamin. You're going to feel better. I don't know that it's really going to help, but you'll feel better about it. If you post a sign at the pool or the gym, use at your own risk. And specifically, let's say you throw COVID-19 language on there. That's going to help for the person who's reading the sign and walks into that facility. So typically you would use that sign at the pool, swim at your own risk. If you don't know how to swim and you drown, you're covered. Same thing with the gym. Use at your own risk. If you don't understand the amount of weight you can lift and you get crushed, we're going to rely on the fact that we posted a sign. This is an infectious disease. So it doesn't really help that you read it, you went to the pool, or you used the gym and then you brought it back, you brought the disease back to your household and the other people who were not using the gym or not swimming in the pool. That's number one. With regard to the waivers, you've got the same issue of the person who is signing it, perhaps not being the ultimate one who was injured by that activity, because the person using the amenity may be fine, but they may bring it back to somebody else in their household who's vulnerable. It doesn't help in that regard. I will also tell you that that courts generally disfavor these types of releases.
So just so I'm clear for our audience, because I know we have some desire.
I have a phone ringing. I hope somebody picks that up at some point.
I did hear something there. So is there any reason why, I understand that they may not have the legal or defensive strength that we wished that they did have, but it would strike me still though that signage at amenities about usage and rules are still a good idea. Do you agree with that?
It's a good idea to say that if you're using this amenity, you need to adhere to our social distancing. You need to be wiping down the machines. Absolutely. I mean, I've got communities with shared laundry facilities where we've put very stringent signage in place about what needs to be done in terms of sanitization and use of those facilities. So I'm not suggesting that signage should be abandoned. I think you should enhance the signage. But I just don't think, I think it could give boards a false sense of security. Here's the other thing, James. The right to use the amenities is an appurtenance to your unit ownership in a condo or a cooperative. If you open that gym, let's say, or the pool, it's open, and now you're saying I can't use it unless I sign a waiver, that is a potential problem because the statute says I have a right to use it. It's an appurtenance to my unit ownership. So that's something to discuss with legal counsel as to whether or not that release can really be required before an open amenity can be used.
Well, it's funny, one of the questions came in, could we restrict the gym usage to age? And I think I know your answer to that, but that it would tie into your if it's open.
Well, certainly minors. I mean, we've always said that gyms cannot be used by minors. So to that extent, yes.
Okay, so I also have a couple of messages here from listeners that it looks to me like the local law is more liberal than the state law, like allowing doubles in tennis or whatnot. What do we do in a community where our local government has actually got looser restrictions than the state?
Yeah. And again, it depends where you're sitting. It depends where you're located. In some communities, your county or municipal order is going to be very strict. In others, it may not even mention pools or these amenities. But here's the thing. There's no more local government than your board of directors. You are the most local government impacting your residents. And you do have tremendous powers at your disposal. I want you to wield them carefully and deliberately, but don't think that you are handcuffed to do anything because your municipality or your county hasn't. Sometimes, I hate to say this, sometimes our politicians punt. They're looking for political cover too. We don't want our board saying we can't do this. And I'll give you an analogy, James. Think on our architectural control provisions. So sometimes an owner wants to do something and they'll present it to the board and they'll say, well, I got a permit for it. And what's our response? That may be fine, we got a permit for it, but it doesn't meet our restrictions. It doesn't meet our architectural guidelines. Just the fact that the county issued you a permit doesn't mean that you're done. You still have to meet our guidelines. And the same applies here with COVID-19. Just because the county has not passed an order that addresses your particular decision to close an amenity or fail to reopen it doesn't mean that the board can't do this. Remember, we talked about this last time. These orders have a lot of gaps in them. They don't answer every question. So you can't look to them. You laid it out beautifully at the outset. There's a framework here. The county order or the municipal order is just one piece of that framework. There's other places to look for answers.
I think your point is well taken, and that the closest level or lowest level of government is us, the board.
Right.
I've had some questions about card rooms and conference rooms and more indoor amenities in some of our communities. And I know you've got a great example of card game that was in the news. Tell us about what we should be concerned about in opening some of the indoor conference rooms, amenity rooms, card rooms.
Sometimes people are thinking, James, about the space and not the activity. It's a two-part equation. So you may say, well, card room, we can space people out around the table, we'll be fine. Now you have to think about the activity. What is the activity? You're all handling cards, you're handling chips. It was the same analogy at the pool. Well, we can space people out, we can space the chairs out at the pool deck, but you're not thinking about the surfaces, that railing getting into the pool, the surface, the coping around the pool. This virus does live on surfaces. You know, the CDC has told us that repeatedly. So when you're thinking about what rooms to open, you have to think about the activities that will be taking place in those rooms. Look, in a lot of our retirement communities and even other communities, we have activities. We've got a lot of committees. We've got card committees. We've got a playhouse, you know, in terms of putting on plays, a drama club. We've got sometimes flower arranging. We've got all sorts of, you've got to think about the activity too. Is there going to be surfaces? Are there going to be, you know, surfaces that everybody in that room will be touching? In which case that's going to be a problem.
Well, you mentioned the Aventure case that hit the news. I'm not sure everyone's aware of that, but it was a group that did play cards, and unfortunately several of them, or a few of them, passed away because obviously they passed the infection to each other with their cards.
It was 10, and all 10 became ill. All 10 were infected, and unfortunately 3 did pass.
Okay, I'm just moving down the framework here and trying to marry in the questions as we go along. And there's some question about how we staff. Some of the orders that have come out of different counties have said you can open X or Y, but you need to have them monitored. So, and I think the questions generally lie, if we have to have staff, you know, does it have to close when they're not there, or can I use board members or volunteers to staff? So do you have any guidance for us on how and we're gonna get to enforcement next, of course, because the purpose of the monitor is to make sure we do what we're supposed to do. But let's just start with kind of the staffing level first, or discussion.
So we did reach out to Palm Beach County because Palm Beach was one of the orders that said you must have somebody monitoring the pool. Okay, so the question became, does that mean, and it said staff or management. So the question was, does it have to be paid staff? Does it have to be a member of our management team? Or could we get unit owners who volunteer or board members? And basically the county's response was, get anybody you want, it's on you, which was unfortunate in my opinion. Could you have owners volunteer? Based on that response we got from the county, I suppose. But the next call I would make would be to my insurance agent to see if those volunteers would be covered should they be injured in the course of their performance. Anything could happen. It would not be my preference to allow people to volunteer to monitor a situation, particularly a situation like that. Anytime you're telling people what they can and can't do, there's the potential for a dispute to break out. So do you really want your board members and owners volunteering to serve in that role? It would be my preference to have a buffer and to have paid staff performing that function. The other question, James, was, well, we have a staff member who's on site, not at the pool, but that he or she could be contacted. In my opinion, that's not good enough either. The intent was somebody there watching. That's the Palm Beach order. The Broward order specifies that you need somebody cleaning down the chairs, the tables, the railings, the gates, any other equipment on the pool deck. That means you need somebody there, which gets back to, okay, we want to open. We know people want to get out there. Maybe we can only afford to have somebody there 3 days a week, 4 hours a day. And that's what you start with. Most of your people are going to understand the financial constraints when it comes to opening the pool, if you let them know. So a lot of people have just been told that the pools can reopen, but they don't understand all the guidelines that have to be followed in order to open them. And it's our job to manage your residents' expectations, because I think the release of these orders actually created some very unreasonable expectations on the part of your residents. You can reopen the pool. They don't understand that there's a lot of things that go into that. And if you can't meet those guidelines, now you have an open pool in violation of an order potentially.
So I think my takeaway there, Don, is you don't have to open or close the pool. Absolutely. It doesn't have to go from 0 to 7 days, 12 hours a day. It can be whatever we think is prudent given our resources. It does, though, lead into the question of enforcement, and I've had several questions here. Look, we're not asking anybody to get involved, physically in any
Please
kind
don't.
of enforcement. But I do think it would be nice to give our audience some tools in their tool belt for enforcement. And one of the ones that's come up at one of our properties this week is their rule is the moment that anyone violates the rules, in this case around their pool, they're shutting down the pool. And so, one way to enforce is simply the amenity is open, kind of at based on these assumptions, and the moment these assumptions are no longer, then the amenity is no longer open. What are some other ways? And there is some questions about, are the courts open? Can we call law enforcement? How do we enforce what is in now a violation? So maybe kind of just bundle those into a little commentary on how we can enforce these rules that we're making up on the go.
So the key to the enforcement, to be able to keep your amenities open, whether it's the gym, a tennis court, a shuffleboard court, your pool, is the way you communicate at the reopening. And by the way, if you botched that communication, it's not too late. This gets back to having those weekly meetings. You can get the word out. But the key is communicating to your owners that they are a key component to these amenities being open and even reopening them more and a relaxing of the restrictions that have been put in place as a result of COVID-19. So in the communities I've worked with, the communication basically said that we're going to start slow, we're reopening, we want to make sure we can manage it, and you, our residents, are a big part of that. If we don't see social distancing being enforced, if we put away our furniture, so a lot of communities have decided to just put away their furniture because they don't want to deal with cleaning it. They've masked out where the furniture goes. If they've got people breaking into the cabana room, taking out the furniture, you may have to reshut the pool. If you've got people that are putting their chairs too close, even if they're family groups, that may be a problem. So the communication is going to be key in terms of keeping the amenities open. By the way, peer pressure is kind of playing a role here because people really are noticing they want these things to stay open. So they are encouraging it. I would say to our boards out there, you might want to be prepared for more squabbles than normal in your community, because you will have people on their own that are policing this to make sure that people are complying with the rules. In terms of the courts are still open for business, particularly when it comes to emergency injunctive relief. If you've got somebody who's violating your protocols, before you go to shut down everything, contact your association attorney. It's been our experience at Becker that one letter and it pretty much does the job, okay? Because we tell them, if you don't stop, we're going to go forward and we're going to get an emergency injunction and you're going to be responsible for these costs. So before you make the knee-jerk reaction, if you've got people that are not complying, before you just shut the switch down altogether, contact your association attorney, see if a letter can do the trick. We can email them. Also, if it's been opened and that person is violating, you've got one violator, go ahead, we can shut them down. You can suspend use rights. Talk to counsel to see if you can do that with fewer than the typical 14-day notice. That's another option. So we do have opportunities here.
Oh, that's interesting. By the way, a couple questions popped in there while you were talking, Donna. Number one, should we name the person that caused us to shut it down? I would say no.
This is like military. Don't they do that in the military, James?
Yeah. And secondly, the use of, if you have a security company at your community, absolutely use them for the enforcement. In other words, you could, if you didn't have the shift, you could add a shift for the security in your common areas, correct? I guess I'm
Yes,
stating.
and I would also say, listen, in every order, the local sheriff has been authorized to enforce the DOH order, the Department of Health. You could conceivably contact the police and have them come out. I can virtually guarantee you they're not going to do that, okay? If you had a quarantine situation where you have an active infection and somebody's leaving the unit, then absolutely I would recommend contacting the local police department and telling them, contacting local Department of Health. But when it comes to, hey, we got people at the pool that aren't wiping down chairs or aren't, adhering to social distancing, I don't think the police are going to be able to run around to every pool and enforce this. This is why it's so important for your board to understand its limitations. There's no cavalry coming to rescue you on this. Do you have the capability to enforce the distancing and the sanitization? Oh, by the way, guest usage. If you do reopen, because again, some communities are going to reopen, others may not. If my cousin lives 2 buildings over and I say, hey, my gym is open, my pool is open, and he says, hey, can I come over and use your gym or pool? You may have an issue with this. In Broward County, their order specifically said that pools are not open for guests. Other orders were silent on this, but this gets back to what we said a few minutes ago, James. You can look to Broward County saying no guest usage at the pools, and just because I'm in Lee County doesn't mean as a board I can't make that same determination and say, you know what, we're opening the pool, but we're not going to allow guests.
Well, it's funny, we're going to get into a couple, we're running low on time, and I do want to get to our discussion on documents, but a couple things. Number one, there's a lot of people asking questions. What about this? What about that? In tennis, you've got people waiting and you've got spectators. Again, you go back to the CDC guidelines. You have to be 6 feet apart and no social gatherings and whatnot. We also have questions about masks. I mean, especially with staff, we're requiring all of our teams to have masks. The other thing that's coming up, we have Memorial Day coming up. So there's a lot of questions coming in here about Memorial Day and grills and whatnot. And, my answer to that, again, is the same as we've been talking about. First of all, the association should make the determination whether those areas or those grills are going to be open as part of their plan. 2, you follow the CDC guidelines. And 3, there's some cleaning protocols. And I've got some questions about what are those protocols. In our plan, we have some recommended frequency, hour, morning, afternoon, daily, what depending on whether it's high touch or not. So those questions that are coming in on cleaning and frequencies, just go info@castlegroup.com and we'll get to that. Any comments on kind of the general Memorial Day? We all want to party. Anything we should be careful about as a board in terms of that? I mean, that's a big weekend, and by that time, we're all going to really want to get out of our house.
Well, absolutely. We're all cooped up. We all want out. But again, there's risks involved with this. So grilling is part and parcel of Memorial Day, right? You're out on the beach, you're by the pool. I think the goal should be to have certain things open by then, but as long as you've got the resources to manage it. Let's take grills, for instance. Those are some high-touch surfaces. You can't just, again, rely on a sign or a waiver on the grill. We're in the midst of a pandemic, okay? If you want to later tell a judge, well, why did you have the grill open in the midst of a pandemic? You're going to have a good reason for that. If I were opening pools, grills, I'd make sure that I had somebody monitoring it. So every time that one person leaves the grill, all the surfaces are cleaned off. People bring their own cooking utensils, okay? Every surface is completely wiped down, and you don't have people crowding around. It's all about the surfaces, the issue here, in addition to the distancing.
We're having questions. I'm going to ask this one, and then I'm going to end with possible thinking ahead of what we could do in a more longer term. Access is always a question. I've got several here. Our guidance to our communities at this point is, look at, you don't want to loosen your access restrictions too quickly. Do you have any kind of high level comments on that, Donna?
If you have a active infection or quarantine in your community, the answer would be don't loosen it. We're still under a state of an emergency. If your protocol said at the outset, we are not going to permit non-essential guests so long as we're under a state of an emergency. The answer to, well, we're opening up some amenities, can I have, non-essential guests? The answer is we're still under state of emergency. Unless you want to go revise your protocol, you can't breach your protocol. And this is so important. We've got boards that are being asked to breach their protocols. You can't do that. You can revise your protocol. If you want to go back as a board and have a meeting and discuss whether or not in consultation with council and with management, do we feel comfortable at this point allowing non-essential guests into the community? You can do that, but you can't just breach your protocol.
In some of your comments there, it struck me that if we parse some of our policy too much, we could also be running into the selective enforcement quagmire, but I think we are all familiar with that. I want to end on you and I had a discussion about, our documents, our rules weren't ready for this pandemic. And honestly, not even our physical building. I mean, I can see buildings changing out their handles on to levers and things that are less infectious. But we should probably be looking at our documents and our rules now so that if this ever happens again, we're better prepared. Give us close us today with your thoughts for our boards to consider and take to their legal counsel about what they could do so we're not kind of caught in this situation again from an ability to act.
Yeah, this crisis has revealed so many areas in our governing documents where we could add language, James, that could help us. For instance, we could add language to the guest occupancy restrictions that makes it clear that the board has the right to suspend non-essential guest visitation in the midst of a pandemic or a medical crisis. We could add language to the leasing and sales screening provisions, which provides that there may be delayed move-ins in the midst of a medical crisis or a pandemic. Overall, I think it is highly advisable to incorporate emergency powers into your documents. That way you're not in a wait and see position, waiting to see what the governor says or what your local county says. Let's put that language in there. We can do that, and then you have it as a board at your disposal, and we can create our own triggering mechanism when those powers would come into existence and how long they would remain at your disposal, rather than having to parse words and try to debate over what these county and state orders mean. So I would absolutely incorporate emergency powers into your documents. If your community allows short-term rental activity, we've got a lot of resorts, we've got a lot of timeshare resorts here in Florida. You've got a lot of short-term rental activity in Miami-Dade and other counties throughout the state. You could amend that provision saying that the board can suspend short-term rental activity in the midst of a medical crisis or a pandemic. Right now, the problem is that some people say, well, I've got the right to rent short-term under the documents. It's solved right now because the governor's order has said there's a ban on short-term rental activity. But let's say that order goes away, but you still have a highly vulnerable community that really should not be permitting short-term rental activity. Having that ability to do it under your documents is going to be crucial. And then I would also amend the unlawful provision section in the documents. Every set of documents, James, has a provision that says no one can make an unlawful use of his or her unit. And one of the conditions we can put in that provision is saying that if you've been ordered to quarantine and you're violating that, or you're violating protocols that were put in place to safeguard residents' health, that's an unlawful use of your unit. That would be very helpful if we need to move forward with an injunction. And then lastly, I would look at the indemnification provision. So we've got all these boards that are doing incredible work right now in uncharted territory. None of them were prepared for a pandemic. They're making decisions. They're under pressure. They should be properly indemnified under the documents for exercising emergency powers.
Those are all good ones. In fact, that may be another whole episode on what we could do. But I wanted to introduce the idea because, our job is to kind of give this information to our listeners so they can go to their advisors and their legal counsel. So we're out of time, Don, and I just wanted to kind of recap. We are continuing on this process of reopening. We're on the right side of the curve. as long as we follow the CDC guidelines, we should stay on the right side of this curve. I think that our guidance is to create a plan. We've provided a framework, get that plan approved by the board, get it approved by legal counsel, do a good job of communicating, because key to this is managing the expectations of our residents, and they read the news and they expect it to happen in your community. You can have a more restrictive plan than the local and state law. When I say communicate, don't be afraid to hold the meetings. Your idea of having a weekly one, I thought was a great one. I mean, that's a great platform. I've offered before, we can provide you all the details on how to do that. So Don, I want to thank you again. This was very helpful, kind of taking us from last week of create a plan to this week, okay, what are the nuances of that plan? What are the limitations of that plan? How does it get communicated? How does it get enforced? We have already committed to this for next week, Don. I don't know whether I told you that.
I'll see you
A
next
lot
week.
of questions I haven't answered, so they haven't gone to waste. I literally take these and try and shape our discussion for next week. So Donna, thank you. And for our listeners, thank you so much again for your leadership. It's just amazing to me what you're all doing, and also your support you're giving our teams on site. So have a good week. Stay healthy.
Stay safe.
We'll work between now and Wednesday to get you some more meaningful information that you can help lead your community. Have a great week. Bye-bye.